And so they met in Fairfield while my mother was still a student at Parker High School, which was then Industrial High School, and the only black high school in the county, really. That's where you could pursue a high school diploma.
But both of them lived in Fairfield?
Both of them lived in Fairfield.
Okay.
And my father was a very young man working at U.S. Steel. He started working at the U.S. Steel mines, coal mines.
Coal mines.
And later worked there for several years and was there working when he and my mother married. And he later, because he discovered early on that the coal mines was interfering with his health, he, together with the local black doctor in Fairfield, Dr. W.L. Drake, arranged to get him out of there, which probably prolonged his life, and that he eventually went to transfer to U.S. Steel and worked at the Fairfield Wire Works until he retired.
Okay. What about the educational background of your mother and father?
My mother was a high school graduate, finished industrial high school. She then took a course in practical nursing and became a nurse and was working at what is now Lloyd Nolan Hospital, was then TCI Hospital. And she died very early, with me, leaving me with my father as a baby.
Oh, is that right?
So I was really reared by my father and my grandmother.
I see. Okay. Did your father remarry?
My father did not remarry, and he lived until he died in 1981.
So you were an only child?
Yeah.
And you lived in Fairfield all of your
I lived in that Fairfield all my growing up years, and went to elementary and high school in Fairfield.
What elementary school was that?
It's now called Robinson Elementary School in Fairfield. At that time, it bore simply the street name, and it was called 61st Street Elementary School. And later, I graduated from what was then Fairfield Industrial High School.
Well, now I've heard an awful lot about Fairfield Industrial High School. Tell me something. What was that experience like going to Fairfield?
It's perhaps the greatest experience of my life. I can say, among other things, I had some of the best teachers I ever encountered, either in law school or college or anywhere else at Fairfield.
Right there, Fairfield.
They were dedicated people. Many of them lived in the community. So you had the problem of obeying in school and obeying at home, because sure enough, you'd run into them on the streets or they'd run into your parents. And we had some real dedicated teachers. And E.J. Oliver was the kind of principal, even in those years of rigid segregation, he would probably be called a colossal Uncle Tom today. But he did it for a very real purpose. What he did, he always kept in the good graces of the white superintendent and the white board. Consequently, we were the only school in Jefferson County during my years in junior high and high school where a course in Black history was taught.
You know, I've heard that. How did that happen? Do you have any?
He somehow was able to convince the white powers that be that we needed to learn Black history. And it was an official part of the curriculum.
So everyone had to take that
Everyone
course.
had to take Black history. And consequently, I knew a little bit more about Black history than many people I ran into in later years in college. And I remember with fondness, my first teacher who taught me Black history was James McWilliams, who died a year ago, who was the longtime coach at Fairfield. He was the mentor of people like Willie Mays and Cap Brown and those in the Fairfield experience. But Mr. McWilliams was a history major, aside from being a coach, and was an excellent history teacher. And of course, throughout his later life, he wrote a lot about Black history, including poetry and other things.
Right. Now, Fairfield obviously has put out a lot of people that's very well noted even today. Can you just name?
Well, we have what we call our Fairfield Industrial High School Hall of Fame, and it's quite interesting. Of course, course, our mayor, Richard Harrington, is product of that school. At one time, and we were sort of highlighted the first in their field. I became the first lawyer of any color, really, who was born in Fairfield, who became a lawyer. And we had a general, Oliver Dillard, who was a general. Of course, everybody know about the legendary Cal Brown, who was a coach. And we have a heart specialist who practices now in Indiana. A series of people who are outstanding in the dental field. We have an outstanding young man who's a graduate of Tuskegee and the veterinarian school, who now retired from the military and now works at Walter Reed and soon to be the Grand Bosselus of Omega Psi Phi fraternity. His name is Adam McKee. And we have Ted Wilson, a lawyer who became the Assistant Attorney General for the state of Indiana. We have a series of people with PhD degrees, Gwen DuBose and her two brothers, Robert DuBose, who was an Episcopal priest and pastored the largest Episcopal church in the
And we don't have time for you to go through all of the
So that is a rich history.
It is very rich. And I noticed as you went through that, you're talking about people in various fields. You're not simply talking about any particular field, but that's just tremendous. Tell me then, what was it like growing up in Fairfield?
Fairfield was a community where it seems even until this day that everybody is a relative, that everybody's a cousin or an uncle or an aunt. And Fairfield was a very close-knit community in those years. A proud community, modest, but everybody, 80% of the people who lived there owned their own little modest homes. And it was a very close-knit community. We had our rigid segregation problems, but somehow the parents and the community helped you to overcome that. We got exposed to history. At my high school, people like Roland Hayes came there. People like Marion Anderson came there. People like Paul Robeson came there. They came when they were appearing at other places. Somehow E.J. Oliver would get them there and expose us to that kind of culture.
That's just tremendous. How active were you in high school in terms of extracurricular?
I was toyed with being an athlete, but wasn't all that good at it. But I captained the debate team at Fairfield, and I graduated as president of my class at Fairfield, and then went on to Wilberforce University.
Was E.J. Oliver that important to Fairfield?
He was probably indispensable to the success of those students. Most of us had no parent who had ever been to college. And yet, starting in the early 1940s, 60 or 70% of his students went to college.
Tremendous. What was the transition like from Fairfield High School to Wilberforce?
I found it very interesting. I got to Wilberforce simply because I wanted to get as far away from home as I could. And I wanted to experience something other than the traditional Southern experience. But I wanted to go to a traditionally black college, and Wilberforce was that college, not in the South, but with a rich history and again, I was blessed. Wilberforce was a great institution, had great dedicated teachers, and it was small enough to offer you an opportunity to grow and be seen, be heard, and whatever.
Had there been other Fairfieldians that had gone on to Wilberforce?
Three of us went from Fairfield out of my class. A young woman, Desi Oliver, the late Paul Watley, and me. Prior to that time, there were no known persons from the Fairfield community, even though there were many from the Birmingham community who had gone to Wilberforce.
Well, why Wilberforce? I know you wanted to get away from home, but what was the attraction? What was the pull?
My maternal grandfather was an avid AME. And of course, Wilberforce had the AME connection. So whenever I visit my mother's side of the family, I ended up on Sunday morning at somebody's AME church. And I became impressed with AME's history. Unlike my own history in the Baptist church, Wilberforce was able to show me, and even in those years, civil rights was important to me. And I can remember being mesmerized by the story of how the AME church was born and how they pulled out because of segregation and how they had educated black folk even before slavery was over.
Mm-hmm. Now, you alluded to the strict segregation that you encountered in Fairfield growing up. How was that manifested? And then as you, well, I want to deal with that one first, and then I want to.
I'll give you an example, and it was the big falling out between me and E.J. Oliver, my mentor, in those years. And as I alluded to earlier, he was the kind of person who would do anything to placate the people who were in authority, and in return, he could extract from them things he wanted for the black community. I decided to, as an elective in the 11th grade, to take a course in building trades. And we were learning to lay brick and learning to make mortar and so forth. The white people at the Fairfield White High School needed a ticket booth built. Now, they also had building trades. And they sent for our teacher and our students to go down to the white school to do the labor of building the brick. And I refused to go. And so that caused a little altercation between me and my principal. I had to go home and give my father for disobeying an order up there. And eventually that was straightened out, and even until his death, Dr. Oliver and I were very, very close friends.
How was it straightened out? What was your father?
It was straightened out simply because my father said that, and he reminded me of that almost daily, that I go to work at the steel plant and catch hell from white folks, so you won't have to do it. And he said to E.J. Oliver, that's something he will not have to do.
So then how did Dr. Oliver deal with you after that?
The relationship was strained even until I graduated from high school. But as fate would have it, 10, 15 years later, when I became a lawyer, a subsequent superintendent who never really liked Dr. Oliver was about to fire him. And it was I who had to save his job.
Is that right? Now, you, a young black man from Fairfield, Alabama, goes to Wilberforce, Ohio. That experience in itself, being so far from home, we assume there was a change in the social fabric of the society there. How did that impact the home?
It was a dramatic change for me, and more dramatic perhaps than most people, because I was only 16 years old. And I went off to Wilberforce, and my father, who had wanted me to go to Morehouse, said to me in no uncertain terms, now you made this choice, and when you get there, it's a choice you're going to have to live with. You ain't coming home, and you ain't going to plug out. And I was ready to come home, but I knew better than to even ask. So I had struggled with it a while, and the young lady who really got me through my freshman year was Leontine Price. I met Leontine on the train on my way to Wilberforce. She was a sophomore and I was a freshman. And she started harassing me a little bit, finding out that I was going. And over the years, we became very good friends. And whenever I felt down and out, I'd go talk to Leontine. And it was really Leontine who got me through that homesickness and that adjusting to college and to the environment. And the few times I get to talk to her, we still talk about that.
Mm-hmm. How active were you as a student at Wilberforce?
Well, about as active as one can be. Immediately I got into the debating team because that was something I had done in high school. And I was very fortunate. At the end of, there was a grant or whatever you want to call it, that was a long-time grant to Wilberforce, and it was to sponsor an oratorical contest. And I entered the oratorical contest with a bunch of seniors. and it would take place just before commencement, and the awards would be granted commencement. And I was fortunate. I won an oratorical contest my freshman year at Wilberforce, so it sort of set the stage then for me. Got out of my little shyness and to do other things. I later became very active with the Wilberforce Student Council, with the debating team, and we had a pre-law club, which I became the president of, and I had a major in economics and political science. And Dr. Milton S.J. Wright was my teacher, a gorgeous man who was very well learned, had received his doctorate from the University of Heidelberg. You may remember the story. Ebony magazine featured him many years back. The title of the article was "I Spent 4 Hours with Hitler," and that was during Dr. Wright's last year in Germany when he had made a remark about Hitler out on the river in a boat that was wired, and he was captured really and brought in to Hitler to explain himself and that sort of thing. And he was an outstanding teacher and was very responsible for my development and getting me ready for law school.
Did he share that with you?
Yes, he did. He shared that story with us, and in fact, I knew the story before it was actually published, because all during the war years, the government, our government, was intent on always letting black folks know that they were very hated by the Germans, which was nevertheless true. But they did not want a story published about a black man who actually sat down and had dinner with Hitler. And so the story was kept under wraps until after the end of World War II.
What years were you at Wilberforce?
I was at Wilberforce from 1945 to 1949.
Okay. When you graduated from Wilberforce, what did you do? What's your next move?
I graduated from Wilberforce in 1949. I was president of my class in 1949. And I started, that was the next big argument I guess I had with my dad. My father was a very strong believer in education, though he had only about a 10th and 11th grade education. Was very bright in terms of, he might not be able to articulate like me, he might not be able to get the grammar correctly, but he could do more with figures in his head than I could do today with a calculator. And he was just that good at that. And he valued education. And apparently, when my mother was on her deathbed, and mind you, I'm like 4 months old, and she knew she was dying, and she asked my father to promise her one thing, that he would educate me. And whenever I would have these little wayward moments in my life, he would always remind me that either I was going to get an education or he was going to kill me, because he had promised my mother that I would get an education. So I never had the option of whether I would go to college or not. And of course, my dad didn't know anything about psychology and what people's aptitudes and capabilities are. All he knew was, if you got a full stomach, you got clothes on your back, shoes on your feet, and you got all your books. And he insisted, if school started today you got every book you were supposed to have. And there was no such thing as no homework. I still have a desk. He bought me an old Secretariat pull-down desk when I was 9 years old. And I passed it on to my son. It's in my house now. And I had to sit there and develop a taste for reading, because I couldn't tell him I didn't have any homework. And I was going to sit at that desk so many hours. So you find yourself reading or doing other things. So he was a stickler for education. And so it was just no point. But back to the argument that we had, when I finished college, I felt I had had enough of the traditional black experience. And I knew my father did not make much money. And I knew that going to Wilberforce had been a tremendous sacrifice for him. Sometimes they would strike and they were off from work. So we had a conference, and I said to him, And in those years, you could always go to the country and teach and get a job. And I said to him, I'm going to go to the country and teach. In 2 or 3 years, saving up money, and I want to go to law school. He said, well, why you don't want to go now? And I said, because you cannot afford to send me where I want to go. I said, I went to a black high school, I went to a black college. Now I want a different experience, and it costs too much. And
this is in 1949.
This is 1949, about a month or so before I'm the graduate. And he said to me, you got accepted to law schools? I told him, yes, I've been accepted to 3 I was interested in. And he said, well, you don't know what my economic circumstances are, or how I can or cannot get money. He said, if you go off to start teaching and get accustomed to what you don't now have, money, he says, I'm afraid you might not go. And he said, and I promised your mom. I said, well, I got an education. I got a bachelor's degree. He said, but now you're promising me. And he said, so you gonna go to law school. So I decided on Boston University. And as fate would have it, things turned out better than I thought. I was in better shape then than I was when I went to Wilberforce, because the state of Alabama kicked in some money because they wouldn't let me go to the University of Alabama.
Was that automatic? Or did you...
That was automatic. The only point, many people didn't get it simply because they didn't know about it. They didn't publish it. But the rules were that they had to pay you the difference between what you would go, since you were black, to Alabama State, which was very inexpensive. And I went to Boston University, and they paid the difference. Even paid your railroad fare twice a year. And up there, the registrar would have to certify that you were in good standing and how much it cost. And they were always willing to help, so they'd always up the prices and send them back to Alabama. And consequently, I was almost able to pay my entire fees.
And you didn't have to make application for that?
Oh, yes, you had to fill out an application initially. But it was not a thing where some committee could turn you down.
It was automatic.
It was automatic.
Once you fill out.
Once you fill out.
That's obviously we've heard of that, and many people have done it, but as you probably suggesting, many people didn't know.
Many people did not know and did not take advantage of that opportunity.
Now you are in Boston, Massachusetts.
Yes, sir.
You are now 20 years old.
That's right.
What is that experience like? First time on a white college campus.
I got off the train at Back Bay. And the first experience I had was somebody had told me you could go to the main station or Back Bay. Back Bay was where the aristocrats and the Boston Red Sox played. Other than that, that was in. And I can remember telling the conductor I wanted Back Bay, and he's trying to convince me, no, that's not where you want to get off. So I knew then immediately, being born of the segregated experience, that he had typed me. But I insisted that Back Bay was where I wanted to get off, and albeit it was closest to me. Boston University had just purchased an old hotel, the Miles Standish, and it was just a beautiful facility like I had never seen before for college people. And I moved into the Miles Standish. And the first thing I soon discovered was that I could walk up and down the streets and I'd never see another black person. And then it dawned on me that I was in an all-white neighborhood, and except for the school facilities itself, there were neither any poor folks or black folks in that area. And so it became very important to me to find out now where you get a haircut. And I picked up a phone and called a fraternity brother. And that was the advantage of being in an all-black fraternity. You got somebody in every city. And he sent me to a barbershop owned by a Phi Beta Sigma man, my fraternity brother. And that started a whole new phase of my life in being introduced to the black community in and around there. And one of the first people I met was Ed Brooke, who later became United States Senator, and Charles Fisher Anderson, whose grandfather had passed the 16th Street across the street, who had also graduated from Boston University. So it was a great, great culture shock and a great experience.
How many black students were in your class?
The magic number was always 4, and we never could quite figure it out. They said they did not discriminate. They said that they didn't have a quota system, but somehow the magic number would always be 4 in those years.
We've been away from Birmingham. Let's come back to Birmingham. Now you graduate from law school, 1953. Is that right?
No, I graduated from law school in 1952.
52. Oh, that's right. So you come directly back to Birmingham?
Come directly back to Birmingham, and before I could sit down good, I'm in the army.
Yeah. Okay. And how long did you spend in the army?
2 years. Went to. I was admitted to the bar while I was gone, really, and because I just took leave and took the bar, and then went ahead and finished my Army career. I was stationed in the 82nd Airborne Division up at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, for the most part. And after my Army history, I then came home to practice law.
All right. Now coming back home to practice law, how many black attorneys are in Birmingham at that time?
There was Arthur Shores, Peter Hall, Oscar Adams, Ozell Billings, and David Hood in active practice. And then there was Philander Butler, who worked for the A.G. Gaston people. But there were 5 lawyers here in active practice, which also was most of the lawyers in the state, too, at that time.
Was that an attraction for you to come back home, or had you already determined that you were coming back to Birmingham?
I made that determination really while I was in the Army. I fell in love with Southern Ohio, and while at Wilberforce, and I had really said that I was going to go back to that area to practice law. But while in the Army, I got assigned to the 82nd Airborne Judge Advocate Section, and I started trying cases as defense counsel in the Army. And I was fortunate. I won first 60 cases without losing one.
First, how many?
60. And it kind of got in my blood. I could see the racism, even though the Army had recently integrated in the Army then, and it was that kind of experience that made me want to come home to practice.
The experience then that you had in the Army was one that helped you to make that determination.
Yes.
By the same token, there were some events that were taking place at the same time. 54, of course, Brown versus Board of Education decision. You were in the military at that time.
I arrived home just time enough. I moved into an office and started practicing with the late Judge Oscar Adams. And we had an office on the 7th floor in the Masonic Temple, and Mr. Shores was down on 5. And while I studied for the bar, I used to use his library because, again, they wouldn't even let me use the library owned by the Bar Association, even though it was housed in the county courthouse, a public facility, but they refused to let me use it. So I had to use Mr. Shores' office. So I was around while he and Thurgood Marshall and others would strategize over what to do. And I was sitting right there with him in his library when they marched off to the University of Alabama with Arthur and Lucy that I had already known earlier. And so I got here time enough, though I was not an active participant, to see that unfold.
Right. Well, you were here during the Montgomery bus boycott.
Well, even prior to the Montgomery bus boycott, my first civil rights case is called Baldwin versus Morgan. Judge Adams and I tried, it was really my case originally. Mr. Carl Baldwin and his wife, Ellen Sr., refused to be segregated at the train station. And
here at Terminal Station?
No, this was at L&N. Okay. They were on their way to Milwaukee to visit for Christmas. And Carl and I had been up the street at the AG Gas and Motel that afternoon. And he announced to me that he was leaving the next morning and that he was not going to be segregated. And I gave him my card and I said, when they put you in jail, call me. And sure enough, Saturday morning, he called me and he was in jail. And that started that case because the Interstate Commerce Commission had ruled that you could not segregate in interstate travel. And he was going to Milwaukee clearly in interstate travel. And we tried the case out in city court, subpoenaed Bull Connor to testify. He cussed me out in the basement of the city hall, said he wasn't coming. And I was a brash young man, so I told him, well, the United States Marshals will come get you. But he showed up and we lost the case in city court, appealed it to federal, removed it to federal court. Judge Lynn ruled against us in federal court and appealed it to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit where we won. Not only did we dismantle interstate travel, but intrastate travel, which brought me then to the terminal station when I personally said, I hear all of the people talk about Shellsworth and Lamar Weaver up there.
57.
Yeah, but most folks don't know how he got there. He got there because I sent him there. Fred and I talked about it when he preached at my church a few months ago. Well, what happened was we were strategizing in our office, how could we now attack the terminal station? And, how people were talking. I said, well, you got to have at least two people, one to buy a ticket in interstate travel and one to buy a ticket in intrastate travel. And I said, Fred, one person needs to say, for instance, and this is the way I said, get a ticket to Atlanta and one to Italian. And Fred took me literally. And they got a ticket, one to Italian and one to Atlanta. And of course, they were beaten and Lamar Weaver beaten even more than Fred up there at that station. Then finally, of course, the courts ruled and the terminal station was no longer segregated. But even after then, they put signs out on the sidewalk with little arrows trying to segregate people on a voluntary basis. If you were going from here to Montgomery, they tell you were in intrastate travel, so you had to sit in the cover. The signs read intrastate or colored waiting room, interstate or white waiting room. And of course, we had then to teach people to ignore that. And they got harassed about the police, but finally that went away.
You were also involved in several lawsuits that related to Stockholm.
Yeah, Stockholm valves and fittings. I've been toying with giving those signs to the Civil Rights Institute. I have a day that we went to trial in that case. All of the facilities at Stockholm was as rigidly segregated as you could imagine. They even had a Bible class that was segregated. And I remember one question I asked the manager at Stockholm on the stand, did they use the same Bible? And he didn't know quite how to answer that. But Stockholm had baseball teams, dental work, the whole shebang, but they were all rigidly segregated. And Patrick James came to me and said that he was a little weary of the situation, and it became known as James versus Stockholm. And we won that case after 2 appeals to the Court of Appeals, and we got some $2 million for the workers and promoting the
Those earlier days when the movement was getting started, you being a young man, just out of college, and you were very energetic. What was your relationship to the movement at the time?
Well, you had, at those years, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, which Reverend Gardner had. I was pretty active with that. I'd go to most of the meetings. And then we had an integrated group, I'm trying to think of its name now, that had to do with registration and voting. At about, I think I was about 24 or 5 years old, I became president of the Fairfield Voters League. And the late W.C. Patton was my mentor on how do you go about doing that. And so we would have the state coordinating committee for registration and voting. I got to be very active with that. And when the NAACP was outlawed in Birmingham, I was the person they sent with those who had the books when the books and records of the NAACP were subpoenaed to the federal court to turn in those books and records and membership lists, which they wanted at that time. And of course, it was a dangerous part in our history. We didn't want to do that.
Yeah. Those obviously were turbulent times. You mentioned that you did attend the mass meetings.
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe a mass meeting?
Very religious oriented. There would always be policemen there, very tense, in spite of the fervor that you get in any African American religious ceremony. There was always the policeman in the back taking notes and taking names, which many people was always fearful of whether they'd have a job the next day. And even when you had other meetings, I never will forget, we had a principal here who was one of the few outspoken people who worked for the school system, but who was also active in the movement, and that was Lucinda Brown Roby. And Ms. Roby was very active in the Christian movement and very vocal. And consequently, she was always followed. And I remember one evening, her husband was a fraternity brother of mine, and we would meet at house to house. And we met at her home, and the policemen were up under the house, listening. And we were having was a fraternity meeting. But it was at Mrs. Roby's house, and there were a large group of men showing up. So they decided that was a time for surveillance.
Did you know that they were under the house?
Oh yeah, they as a matter of fact, Mrs. Roby spoke about the fact that they're up under the house and they're around there, and we don't care. And one of them yelled from under the house, "Yeah, we're here, and we're going to be here until." So they were making no bones about it, and it was a process of intimidation.
It's the same thing with the meetings. They would come and
sit in the meetings.
And this, of course, was an attempt to intimidate.
Intimidate.
Now, you, unlike many other people who were involved with the movement, you were really self-employed.
Yeah.
So you didn't have to worry about being fired from your job.
Except that I had a wife who was a school teacher. And they talked about what they were going to do to her and that sort of thing. But of course, later on, I used my own daughter and sued the Birmingham School Board to integrate the Birmingham system. They had a class for gifted children, and they wanted to have one for black children and one for white children. And Dr. Christian was there, and the superintendent, and I filed suit against the city board to integrate that system. And my daughter was the plaintiff in that case. She was in the 5th grade.
What school?
At that time, they had 2 schools for white children. One on the western side of town, which was Eagleton. One on the eastern side of town, which was Robinson. And the gifted children from the western side of town went to Eagleton, and those in the east went to Robinson. And because blacks, and primarily a group of black teachers who had bright children, started complaining about it, they set up a class for gifted children for black kids at Washington School in Tennessee. The standards I later learned, I didn't know it at the time, were not the same. All I knew was that they were segregated, and it shouldn't be, because I created some problems for myself in the black community once I filed suit, because then the standards became known, and of the black children, and I could have been a victim as anybody else, but of the black children, 3 of them were accepted on the standards that they had at Eagleton. One happened to be my daughter and 2 boys. And they maintained after that the class for black kids over at Washington.
What year was this?
About 1966, 67.
That's early on.
That's early on. This was, and Deirdre had an IQ of 166. And I forgot what the cutoff was, but the cutoff they were using eliminated those 18 or 20 kids except for 3. And those 3 went home to you. So my daughter, I think she gained her toughness over there. because she was one of 3 black kids and the only girl. And so I think she gained her toughness a while over that. She was ostracized and so forth, but
Then you, I'm assuming, would take her to school
yeah,
every morning.
every morning, and one of us would pick her up. Me or my wife would pick her up every afternoon.
What would she come home and tell you? I mean, was that a fearful time for the family?
And she was never afraid. They would just make snide remarks. The teacher was not that nice either, but she was a bright student. They did not penalize her with grades. They just could not intimidate her with ostracism. And she learned to be a loner and do things by herself, and was a good student. And since that time, they've had class reunions and sang for her. But and she left that and went on and and again she went to high school being the only black student in the school.
What school?
She went to Brook Hill. It's now called Altamont. And at that time, it was an all-girls school called Brook Hill. So we applied, didn't have to sue anybody. They accepted her. And the only problem she had was that she was the only black person at the school, except for the maid and the janitor.
Did you ever encounter any personal attacks on you by any of the officials in town or any of the white citizens in town?
Not here. I got followed by Bobby Shelton a lot in Tuscaloosa. See, I handled demonstration cases in Marion, Tuscaloosa, Gad, and those places. And I had a guy try to run over me with a gasoline truck in Greensboro, Alabama. Other than that, taunts and white folks walking behind you, threatening you as you walk to a meeting or to a courtroom or church, telling you what you're going to do, calling you niggas. Other than that, that was pretty much it.
Did you live in the area where you live now? That's what I was
No, early on I lived in Fairfield, and then Tennessee. So most of my civil rights activities at that time I was living in Tennessee.
This, obviously we don't need more time to do this because you have so many things that you can share. But you work with Oscar Adams. You have, you've worked with all of the most noted individuals here, and you probably can give a history of each of them. What was that relationship like among you as a very small fraternity of individuals in that profession?
We had Charles H. Houston Legal Study Club, and I was telling Fred very recently, because Fred was the next lawyer behind me who came to the state. What great times we had, and I think the younger lawyers don't have that kind of rapport. We are wives, and once a month we sat down and we discussed the law, and we had dinner, and then we had outings together, and it was a very you could call on any one of them to assist you if you needed it at any time. It was a great relationship.
You have gone on to, let me ask this. What was your decision, probably why did you make the decision to eventually run for elective office?
Well, I thought about an experience I had when I got ready to apply for the bar. I am probably the only person in Alabama who took the law school admissions test by himself. When I got ready to take the test, the Educational Testing Service at Princeton, as you know, does all of it. And they put me in at the University of Alabama to take the test. And they refused to let me take the test. So the Educational Testing Service had to send a proctor from Princeton, New Jersey, all the way and I had to travel from Fairfield to Tuskegee to take the exam in a big classroom with a proctor by myself. And I realized how much politicians, state legislators, had to do with the climate on a college campus. Because I had also witnessed the same kind of thing in Ohio. Paul Robeson came along with Henry Wallace while I was a student to sing at Ohio State and present Henry Wallace, who was running for the presidency. And a lone legislator threatened Ohio State and to cut off its funds, and if they let Paul Robeson and this Connie Wallace appear up there. I was a student council leader, and I led a group from Wilberforce to Columbus, Ohio, and we brought Paul Robeson and Henry Wallace back to Wilberforce to give that speech and put on the program one of our talented young people to sing, Leontine Price. Paul Robeson heard her, loved her, and helped her get to Juilliard. So I remembered how important a legislator can be and effective he can be. And I decided, born of those two basic experiences, that I wanted to run for public office.
And what year did you run initially?
1985.
And that, since 1985, you have been involved in, I'm sure, a lot of...
I've been involved in a lot of things. I've learned the legislative process, and consequently, I now chair judiciary, and we've never had an African American to chair judiciary before. We've had them on the committee, but we get 33% of all the bills that comes to the legislature. And not only that, it puts you on the legislative council, which runs state government when the legislature is not in session. So I have finally gotten to a position of power where I can really determine the fate of some legislation and ultimately help people with jobs and so forth, because we have to approve those things on the legislative council.
One of the things that I've found, and many people talk about, is that we get in certain positions, do we bring anyone along? Is there any mechanism by which we can bring somebody along with us to look at what we're doing, to influence, other younger people to do the things that you are?
I do two things. There's no training period, but ever since I've been in the legislature, I've sponsored to the legislature the Mouse College political science group, and they'll be coming in April every year. And I sponsor a group of really underprivileged youngsters at Lincoln Middle School every year. I bring them to Montgomery at my expense. I rent the bus, I furnish the food, and couldn't get the parents to come with them and the teachers to come with them, and treat them to not only a day at the legislature, but all of the historic places around Montgomery.
You're also a city attorney. Tell me about that position. How do you manage to do so many things?
Well, when I got to be city attorney, I sat down before then with the mayor, told him I was in the legislature, and I convinced him that my position as a legislator could enhance my position as a city attorney and ultimately the city, and I think it has. And that once a year during a 3-month period of time, I'd be gone half of the week. And it has worked, and it is because, well, you have a staff, you can get other people to do things. It puts an extra burden on me because I come to work before I go down there. I'll come back in the middle of the week and go back and do whatever I need to do. But it has been a very good experience in that I'm now in a position that I can put the agenda of the city of Birmingham at the top of the calendar and get bills passed, like our drug nuisance law. Never would have gotten passed had I not been a member of the legislature.
What would you say has been your most rewarding accomplishment in your political life? I mean, I know that's asking an awful lot. If I were to ask you that question I have, what would you point to? Maybe one or two things.
Well, as a politician, strictly as a politician, I think it's rising to the chairmanship of the Judiciary Committee, strictly as a politician. Behind that, I would say that I have been able to do a lot for the court system, because many times I've been the only voice who could do something for the court system. I have personally, unfortunately, neither one of them's there now. I have personally got two people appointed judges. Carol Smitherman, and I got that, and actually gave me the charge, and Kenny Simon. And of course, Kenny decided to leave and go into private practice. And he called me before then and said, I know you're going to be angry with me about this stuff I work so hard. I said, I am, but I understand. And as a politician, I think those, because that way we had no black circuit judges except Ralph Cook, who had been down in Bell, none in the Birmingham division. And then, Judge Pearson was over there, but nobody doing civil work. And we were able to do that. But I think ultimately, if I had to look at my whole career, being a product of Fairfield, I struggled to integrate the Fairfield schools, make their teacher salaries equal, and because they were paying them what they wanted to. And that's really one of the real things that I had. I filed suit to integrate virtually every emergency room at a hospital in the city. And I like to believe that saved some lives. I like to believe that, and I did it because a relative of mine had an automobile accident. And they were in there looking at people so tough, and he was bleeding, and in the so-called colored waiting room. And I filed suit at Lloyd Nolan and other hospitals. So I like to believe that every time I go to a waiting room and know that some black person's got a fair chance at getting immediate service is very, very important to me. And when I look at places of public accommodation, and the black folk I know who are foremen at jobs now, who used to be laborers. At Birmingham Southern Railroad, they could only be switchmen. They're driving the trains now. At Stockholm Bath, they are metallurgists and so forth now. At U.S. Pipe, they're running whole shifts and foremen now. When I look at all of those things, I think that whatever I've done, it has spilled over. Those people are able to send some folks to college where they didn't have the money before. And those have been, I think, the highlights of what I've done.
I know, time is almost spent. I know you have a meeting. Let me ask you one final question. There's been some discussion around town about the old timers who were intimately involved in civil rights cases, and some criticism of younger attorneys today who seemingly are not as adept in that area. What would you say to young attorneys that are coming now in relationship to this disparity, if you view it as that?
Well, the times are so terribly different. We had a lot more time on our hands. We didn't have the business that some of the younger ones have now. But I say to them that, take a civil rights case, represent the downtrodden, even if you don't get any money, because I'll guarantee you that ultimately it'll repay you fourfold. Somewhere along the way, somebody that you do something pro bono for to improve the human condition, somebody will remember and you will make a good living otherwise. I don't think it ever failed. I think that admonition is as good today as it was 30 years ago.
Attorney Newton, I want to thank you for taking this hour with me, and maybe we'll be able to do it some other time too, because you have another 50 hours.
Thank you much.